Let's go ahead and settle the argument of why no black person in the world should be Christian. So I'm going to give you a brief breakdown of Christianity and Africa, Christianity and any person of color in the Americas, throughout Europe and North Africa. So the first part that we have to understand, and I'm using his questions uh, to make sure that we have a clear understanding of this, because many Christians will claim that Christianity was in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. Now we have to realize that yes, Christianity did come to Africa before the transatlantic slave trade, but you have to be very precise as to what part of Africa and when in Africa and how in Africa. Now, as we all know, Africa is from the Sinai Peninsula on through the rest of the continent. Egypt would be considered part of the Mediterranean culture, the Mediterranean history. So when we talk about Christianity in the late first century, second century, third century, and up until the fourth century, then what we see is Christianity being more of a Mediterranean event that was going on, a Mediterranean spread. So at the same time frame around the late first century that Christianity began to spread outside of the Levant, which is modern day Israel, Syria, Lebanon, that area, when it started spreading outside of the Levant, it spread into Turkey, it spread into Rome, it spread into Europe, the Mediterranean portions of Europe, and the Mediterranean parts of Africa in the late first century into the second century, third century, fourth century. So, yes, it was in Africa, in northern Africa, the Mediterranean Africa. It did not cross the Sahara Desert in the first, second, and third century. So there were no Christians in West Africa at the time frame of the first, second, and third century when it was in Egypt. Now, many jumped to Ethiopia at this point. In Ethiopia, there was no Christianity nor Judaism to nothing to not to a level to be recognized in history, not to a level that it was recognized by government, not to a level that it even made a dent. So the stories of the eunuch going down and converting the courts in Egypt, I mean in Ethiopia, is simply a lie. The kingdom of Axiom or DMT maintained their religions in all of their polytheistic gods throughout from the first century, second century, third century, and did not change into the fourth century. What happened in the fourth century? Well, in the fourth century, you had a boat that crashed in Ethiopia. There was a gentleman on board. He was part of the Coptic church in Egypt. His name was Frumentius. Frumentius became a slave to the court of the Axiom Empire. He was then released, allowed to go back to Egypt. Once he returned to Egypt, he got permission from Athanasius, who was the bishop of the Coptic church in Alexandria, Egypt, to go back to try to convert King Azana. King Azana, who had repelled Roman advances to the point where it was stalemated and they were becoming more of a trade partner in the fourth century, which we're talking 300 BCE, I mean 300 CE. King Azana, for political reasons, to align himself closer to Rome in 330, allowed for Frumentius to convert him over to Christianity for political reasons. Since Rome was showing favoritism towards Christianity, the Council of Nicaea had already happened. The Bishop Athanasius was sending out what the Easter is going to be celebrated on, as well as sending out the what he thought the canon should be. But Frumentius had brought Ethiopia a canon that included the books that you now are part of the Apocrypha, which is why the Ethiopian church is different from the Roman Catholic Church and from the Protestant churches, because when Frumentius, who was coming from Alexandria, Egypt, he brought them Enoch and Jubilees and all these other books that are not part of your canon. So they were able to form a different version of Christianity than the Romans formed. It wasn't more spiritual. It wasn't a truly African one. It was one that accepted the more popular books at the time frame, which would be your books of Jasher and Maccabees and things of this nature. And because Ethiopia wasn't conquered, but came into Christianity under the king of King Azana forced Christianity onto Ethiopia. So the Ethiopians had to give up their worship of their gods because their king forced them to. Now, understand that life was different back then. If the king said this is the religion, this is the religion, because the religion and the kingship ran hand in hand. Now, you don't have Christianity spreading into sub-Saharan Africa after that, by no means. It is not until around the late 1400s, around 1457, that there was a dispute between Portugal and Spain over the Canary Islands. And Portugal and Spain were fighting over the Canary Islands, and they were bringing slaves from the Canary Islands up into Europe. At that time frame, they had converted many of the people of the Canary Islands over into Christianity. Pope Nicholas IV wrote a papal bull that said that, hey, if they have been converted over to Christianity, you cannot make them slaves. And I'll get to that in just a minute of why. But you cannot make them slaves. But because he wanted the Portuguese and the Spaniards to help fight in a crusade against the Ottomans, he, in his papal bull, told them that it is their Christian duty to go into West Africa and to force Christianity on the people, to enslave the people, and he gave them permission to do so. And in doing so, they first met with tribes and they bought POWs from the other tribes and traded guns to those tribes. Those tribes took the guns, fought their wars against other African nations. Like, for instance, the Dahomey received guns to fight against the Wayuda. And in fighting the Wayuda, they then captured them and sold them into slavery to the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is why most of them ended up in Mexico, in the Caribbean, and in South America. So it's not that they were Christians. They were fighting their own political wars in their own countries and took advantage of the superior technology of guns in order to win their battles, to win their wars. So these were not Christians selling Christians. These were not people choosing Christianity. They were forced into Christianity through the transatlantic slave trade because of a papal bull by Pope Nicholas IV. So the many claims that that these Africans had already converted over to Christianity is nothing more than a lie. It's even a lie when they say that the Wayuda tribe is the tribe kingdom of Judah. It was called and mapped out as the kingdom of Judah simply because the Portuguese and the Spanish couldn't say Wayuda, and so they just renamed it Judah. It has nothing to do with those people calling themselves that. Those people called themselves the tribes of Wayuda. The Dahomey called them the tribes of Wayuda, which is indicative of, I believe, a god of that area and a plant of that area. It has nothing to do with with the tribe of Judah at all. Now, the last part, and this is the part that why most black people should not be Christian at all. The morality of Christianity is in play. Now, I know you're not going to like this, but the transatlantic and the trans-Sahara slave trade was done just according to the will of this God in this book, this Yahweh or Allah, whichever name you want to call him. Now, many Christians will cite that in Leviticus 25, which is listed up here, it will cite the first parts of Leviticus 25 and the first part of this that I posted, that of your fellow Israelites, you are not to treat them as slaves, you are not to call them slaves, but they are more of employees, because they are coming to you as a slave because of indebtedness. But once you get to verse 44, what does it say? It says that of the foreign nations and the foreigners amongst you, you may buy them as slaves. That they're males and females, that's where you get your slaves from. And they will be your property forever. And you will be able to pass them down to your sons as property. The transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Sahara slave trade, was done in accordance with how the Bible speaks of slaves, of Europeans taking Africans, taking indigenous Americans and making them into slaves. The reason why when they did that to the Irish, they had to release them in the 7th year and they had indentured servitude is because they were following the Bible. No black person, nobody period, but especially no black person should be willing to be Christian because this Bible condones the very slave trade that decimated your ancestors. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable.